I'm going to move on with the second part of this PowerPoint, which is on thalamus, and then at the end I'll briefly discuss the reticular system because we've been talking about it occasionally. Now when you look at the thalamus, it is a very, very large nuclear mass. It's one of those islands which was left behind within the core of the cerebral hemispheres, and it is the largest nuclear mass that is seen. It is found in a region which is known as the diencephalon. So the thalamus is part of a region called the diencephalon. This diencephalon is made up of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and another portion called the epithalamus. And the thalamus has such diverse connections that you cannot assign a single function to it. But one function that we can say is that it is an important relay station for many other fibers which come from elsewhere. Now let's, since we are on this diagram, I just want to show you how the thalamus is divided. There are two thalami, and the two thalami are connected to each other by a mass of nervous tissue which passes across, which is called the massus intermedia, or also called the interthalamic adhesion. And between the two thalami in this area, this is where the third ventricle will be. So the third ventricle is actually going to be in this area. And then, it comes down as the it will continue as the cerebral aqueduct. Now if you look at the thalamus, you have a Y-shaped band of nervous tissue in the center which divides the thalamus into three portions, as you can see this Y, and this is called the internal lamina. It divides the thalamus into an anterior part, and this anterior part is called the anterior nucleus. Then we have a mass which is present laterally, so this area is the lateral nucleus, and I'll come to it. And then of course we have this part medially, which is this medial part, and this medial is the medial nucleus. The medial nucleus is also sometimes known as medial dorsal nucleus. Now this lateral part which we see here is divided into two portions. So you have a portion which lies more dorsally, so this is the dorsal tier of nuclei. These gray are the dorsal tier of nuclei, and then we have a set of nuclei present below which form the ventral tier, because if this is the dorsal aspect of the thalamus and this is the ventral aspect of the thalamus, so these are the ventral tier of nuclei. So you have a dorsal and a ventral tier of nuclei. This ventral tier is further divided into a part which lies anteriorly, so that's known as ventral anterior nucleus. There's a part in between which should really have been called ventral intermediate, but it's known as ventrolateral nucleus. And then this one is present posteriorly compared to this, so this is called ventral posterior nucleus. This ventral posterior nucleus is further divided into a part which is, one part is present more medial, so we'll call it that ventro-postro-medial, and this one is ventro-postrolateral. These are the two nuclei that you've been hearing of all this while. If you remember the trigeminal lemniscus, anything from the face, sensations went to the ventro-postro-medial, and from elsewhere in the body like the medial lemniscus and spinal lemniscus, they go to the ventro-postrolateral nucleus. So this is the area where they are present. Now some of these nuclei that I would really like you to remember are, of course, this ventro-postromedial and ventro-postrolateral. You should know a little bit about the anterior nucleus, which I will describe. And then on the posterior most aspect of the thalamus, you have two rounded areas. These are known as the lateral geniculate body and the medial geniculate body, or also called lateral and medial geniculate nucleus. You must know these because we've already done that. The lateral, we will be doing the lateral in a little more detail. The lateral is with the visual pathway and the medial is with auditory pathway, and maybe the way you can remember is AM. As soon as you get up in the morning, AM, you hear noises, so medial geniculate body is with the auditory pathway. So you should know this, and then we'll see how the pulvinar, which is again this largest part over here, this pulvinar is related to the visual and parietal areas. Now in your notes, if you look at the description, so next we go here to this picture. So this is showing you a little bit about the gross features of the brain. So you can see this is the complete cerebral hemispheres of one side, the cerebral hemisphere of one side. This is a little sulcus which divides this into a frontal lobe. This part here is parietal, and we take a line which goes across like that. This is the occipital, and this is the temporal lobe. So you're looking at the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, so you can't see the thalamus up here. If you turn it around and then you look at the medial surface of the brain, if you look at it, then you can see the thalamus up here. So this is where the thalamus is present. So this is, you can see in the core, it's right in the center, and this area is known as the diencephalon, where you have the thalamus, and then the part below this area here is the hypothalamus, and then when you go posteriorly up here, this area is the epithalamus. So all of this together forms the thalamus. Forms the diencephalon. So all of this together forms the diencephalon. Now if you look at the next slide, here what has been done is that this is the cerebral hemisphere, and a window has been cut out from the cerebral hemisphere. So if you remove that window, so you remove a part of brain tissue, then the first thing you actually see will be white matter tracks which go down this way. These tracks, which is white matter, these consist of ascending and descending tracks, and you can see they are going out like this, like a crown. So this is known as coronal radiator, and they are going to different parts of the brain. You can see this is going to the frontal lobe, this again to the frontal, fibers going to the parietal, the posterior part of parietal, they are going to the occipital, then you'll have fibers going down here to the temporal. So you can see how this band of white matter goes across like this and then disperses to all areas of the cortex. So that is the first thing that you will see. And this coronal radiator, this is the part where it looks like a crown, this area here. But notice when it comes close by, all of these fibers have, in this part, they come very close to each other. So this is the area, the band comes down close to each other, and where they come down up here close to each other at this point, this is what is known as the internal capsule. And this internal capsule actually lies between structures which are present lateral and medial to it. So you will actually first see a big nucleus here, and this once you remove this nucleus, so there'll be actually a big nucleus here. Once you remove that nucleus, then only you can see this coronal radiator. Once you remove that coronal radiator, then medial to that again you'll see some nuclear masses. So you can see, so if you take a section through the area, this is what it's going to look like. So this part here is where it's going to spread out, the coronal radiator. So notice, if this is lateral and this part is medial, so it's got a nuclear mass lateral to it, and it's got nuclear masses medial to it. So that's how it passes between these masses, and as it passes between these masses, it has to come close to each other, and that's where it forms the internal capsule. So where it spreads out, it's known as coronal radiator. Where it comes close to each other, it's known as the internal capsule. Now here in this image, what I'm trying to show you are the relations of the thalamus in all of these images. So before you understand that, if you just remember the first introductory lecture we did, we said that the brain developed, initially the brain develops, and let me use one of these pages here. So when the brain develops, initially it develops as a tube. So there is this neural tube. So there is this tube growing, and this tube has a layer of nervous tissue on the outside. This tube is the primitive neural tube, and it's inside this cavity is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This tube then begins to grow and it branches out. So what it does is it branches out this way, and comes down this way. And then the nervous tissue now increases in amount as this tube is growing. So as this tube is growing, this will form the lateral ventricle on either side. This part is the third ventricle, this is the aqueduct, this is the fourth ventricle, and this is the central canal. And all of this here is the nervous tissue. Now this nervous tissue increases in size. So let's just draw, let me just draw or remove this. So the amount of nervous tissue increases. So let's look at the lateral ventricles here, and you can see they are connected to the third ventricle. So this area is what is called that interventricular foramen, and this nervous tissue which is present here if I was just to color this, this is the nervous tissue present here. It's increasing in size, this nervous tissue. Now this nervous tissue, as it's increasing in size, what happens is up here it increases in size like this, and there's another island of gray matter up here. Then there's gray matter present here, and then on the outside, of course, we have the gray matter like this. So the same thing will go on that side. So this looks a little confusing. So let me just, I might have confused the issue here. So let me just do another simple thing. So this is the lateral ventricle, the third ventricle, and then that becomes the aqueduct, the fourth ventricle, and down. And then I said the nervous tissue was increasing in amount, and as this nervous tissue increased in amount, if you remember, I said that most of the nervous tissue, first let's say the nervous tissue increased in amount this way, forming the cerebral cortex. So all the gray matter actually moved to the periphery. So the gray matter started moving out to the periphery. So that's where you had the cerebral cortex. Some of that gray matter remained within the core, and that's where it formed islands. So again, we have that some of this gray matter remained as a core up here, here, and then some here on either side. So you can see that some of the gray matter remains here, up here, and then here, and then you have a few others elsewhere, but otherwise it goes off to the periphery. So this gray matter which has remained up here in the core, this one here is what is known as the thalamus. Now if you look at the thalamus, you can understand that if you look at the thalamus, you can understand this is the third ventricle. So the thalamus on either side forms the lateral wall of the third ventricle. So if this is the third ventricle, this obviously will be its lateral wall. So this thalamus forms the lateral wall of the third ventricle. So it forms the lateral wall of the third ventricle, and this is part of the lateral ventricle. So you can see this area here is the floor of the lateral ventricle. So this thalamus is lying in the floor of the lateral ventricle. So you can see up here. So it forms the floor of the lateral ventricle, and that's what is given in the in your notes. So if you go back to your PowerPoint and you look up here, and this is showing you a section taken from this part, section taken from this area, and it's a coronal section, so you see that up here. So you can see the two lateral, one here, you can't see the other one, but if I was to draw it, that's how it would be. So that's the lateral ventricle on either side. That here is the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricle, and then you can see the third ventricle in between. And here we see the thalamus. So this is the thalamus. So here this is the thalamus. And notice how it's forming the lateral wall of the third ventricle, and its upper surface here forms the floor of the lateral ventricle. So I hope that explains it. Then to go back to this, fibers which are coming from the cortex or fibers which are going to the cortex, so let's say as they come down, you see they pass through this area and then they come down, and then we have other fibers which are going up, so they also pass through to go to the different areas of the cortex. So all of this is what is known as coronal radiator, and as they pass down you can see they kind of get close to each other, so that area is what is known as the internal capsule. So this same thing I'm going to show now in the PowerPoint, and if you look here in your, and it says in your notes, so you can see this if you look at the thalamus, if this is the thalamus, this is the medial part of the thalamus, this area is the lateral part of the thalamus, and this lateral part of the thalamus is related, as you can see, to the internal capsule. So this here is the internal capsule. So the lateral surface of each thalamus is related to the internal capsule. Also, in between, the two thalami are attached to each other over here, as I told you, by something known as the interthalamic adhesion. So this interthalamic adhesion passes through the third ventricle. Now here if you look at the same section, but it's taken a little, you can see it's seen from the top. So here you can see this lateral mass, nuclear mass, is known as the lentiform nucleus. This one over here is known as the caudate nucleus. Now get familiar with these names because the lentiform and caudate are part of nuclei which are known as basal ganglia. And then this of course is the thalamus. Now when this internal capsule, so again to show you what is meant by the posterior limb. So when this internal capsule, as it's passing through this area up here, so we had these three nuclear masses, one here, and up here, like this. So this was the caudate nucleus, this was the thalamus, and this was the lentiform nucleus. And as fibers passed through this area, either they were going up or they were coming down, this internal capsule, which is like this, it's almost like a V. It's this way. Let me use another page. So the internal capsule is like a V this way, with the lentiform nucleus here, caudate nucleus here, and thalamus here. It's kind of divided into two limbs. This area which is related to the thalamus is known as the posterior limb. This area here is called the anterior limb, and this bend is known as the genu. Genu means bend. So that is what this image is trying to show you, that here as this internal capsule is passing between these three nuclear masses, the thalamus is related to the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So whenever you're given these gross features, it's very important for you to understand and relate it with what you're seeing in the pictures, because you will get questions on this. Which surface of the thalamus is related to the third ventricle? Which surface is related to the internal capsule? Or it could be the internal capsule is related to the lateral surface of the thalamus. Is it true or false? So that's how you're going to look at this. Now let's move on to the next slide, which are the nuclear masses, and I already went over this in the first slide. It's much better seen in the first, and I explained it there, but we'll go over it again. So you can see you have this lamina, Y-shaped lamina, dividing it into an anterior, a medial, we can call it medial dorsal, and then this whole thing is the lateral nuclear mass. The lateral is further divided into a dorsal tier and a ventral tier. So this dorsal tier, the names are sometimes a little odd. It's called lateral dorsal, and then you have lateral posterior, and this part is called the pulvinar. And then the ventral one, instead of you call it, instead of lateral ventral, it's known as ventral anterior. This part is ventral lateral, and this is ventral posterior. And if you remember, I told you this is the one which is divided into ventroposteromedial and ventroposterolateral. Then we have the geniculate bodies, the lateral geniculate body and the medial geniculate body. So these two over here. So these are the thalamic nuclei. Now let's look at the connections of the thalamus, and before we go through this, let me try and explain it to you differently up here. So here we have the thalamus. So I'm drawing the thalamus of this side, the right side. So this is lateral and this is medial. So this is the interthalamic adhesion. Here's the Y-shaped lamina. And then we have the geniculate bodies. And this is the lateral nucleus. If you remember, it was divided into the two tiers. This was the dorsal tier and this is the ventral tier. And in this ventral tier, the one important one that I really wanted you to know was the ventroposterolateral, and this one was the ventroposteromedial. Now as a whole, the thalamus has connections with the sensory pathways, it's an important relay station for the sensory pathways. So those sensory pathways are, if you remember, the medial lemniscus and spinal lemniscus came to this ventroposterolateral nucleus, whereas the trigeminal lemniscus came to the ventroposteromedial nucleus. So you can see up here that this is the connection with the sensory pathway. Then it has connections with the basal ganglia and with the cerebellum. These are again very important. I've already mentioned the cerebellum when we did that. If you remember, we had a tract which was called the dentatothalamic tract. From the dentate nucleus it goes to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus it goes to the cortex. Or we had something called the dentatorubro-thalamic. So it went from the dentate nucleus to the red nucleus, and then from the red nucleus to the thalamus, and then from there to the cortex. And just so that I refresh your memory, let's go up and let me show it to you in the PowerPoint up here. So you remember, this was the cerebellum. In the cerebellum, the dentate nucleus was most important. So you had dentatoroubro-thalamic thalamocortical, or dentatothalamic thalamocortical. So you can see that. So that was the cerebellar connection, which you're already familiar with. The basal ganglia, that I just mentioned two of them, the lentiform nucleus and the caudate nucleus. Now these also relay in the thalamus before they go to the cerebral cortex. So what do these two do? The basal ganglia and the cerebellum, they modify movement on a minute-to-minute basis. And the cerebral cortex, the motor cortex, sends information to both, and both structures, they send information back to them. So, you know, they have reciprocal connections with the cerebral cortex. But for these, in order to go to the cortex, they have to go via the thalamus. And the output of the cerebellum is excitatory. So the output of the cerebellum is excitatory, whereas the output of the basal ganglia is inhibitory. Now it's the balance between these two systems which allows your body to do smooth, coordinated movement. And if there is a disturbance in either system, you see that as movement disorders. You already saw in the case of cerebellum, remember, where you had those intention tremors. Now you must remember this, because when we do the basal ganglia, again you will see that when we are doing basal ganglia, we end up with, again, movement disorders. So you have movement disorders with basal ganglia too, and then you'll understand why, because they coordinate it so finely that if any part of the pathway is gone, that fine coordination is gone. So here, let's erase all of this. so that we come back to the connections of the thalamus. So we said it had connections with the basal ganglia and with the cerebellum. So these ventral tier of nuclei, you have connections with the basal ganglia, and then we have connections with the cerebellum. With the basal ganglia, apart from movements, the connections are also to do with emotions and visceral responses. Then the thalamus has connections with what is called the limbic system. The limbic system is important because it has extensive connections with the autonomic nervous system, so it takes care of a lot of visceral reflexes. You have emotions, memory, and a whole lot of things are connected to this limbic system. And the thalamus is connected reciprocally to the limbic system. One of the parts of the limbic system is an area in the brain which is called the cingulate gyrus. And to show that to you, if you look here, this area, this part here, this area is the cingulate gyrus, and that is connected to the limbic system. So the thalamus has extensive connections to the limbic system, and those connections are through these nuclei. So through these areas, there are connections with the limbic system. And it also has, this anterior nucleus has connections to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is also connected to the limbic system. So you can see how the thalamus has extensive connections with the limbic system. So it's connected to visceral reflexes, emotions, memory. It is connected to motor movement through the cerebellum and basal ganglia, and it has connections with the sensory pathways. So now let's look at the image that we had, which was here. So this is what this is showing you. And then if you look at it functionally, the thalamus has three functional groups. One is the relay nucleus. So there's a group of relay nuclei, and those were the ones I described really over here. So this anterior group, which is up here, this has connections with the hypothalamus. So this has connections with the hypothalamus. And from the hypothalamus, it goes to the cingulate gyrus. So that's how it is connected to the limbic system. This plays a role in memory, with visceral reflexes and emotions. Then we have the these ventral tier of nuclei I just showed you. So this is connected, this globus pallidus is part of the basal ganglia. So this globus pallidus which we see is basal ganglia. This is also basal ganglia. So you can see it's connected to the basal ganglia and it is connected to the cerebellum. So through this you can see there is fine motor movement. Then we have these nuclei which are the important ones. These are sensory pathways. And again, you must know what VPM receives and what VPL receives. And sometimes if these, if the connections from these nuclei to the cortex is lost, then you'll have a complete loss of sensation, but you also can get bouts of severe pain, which is known as thalamic syndrome. It's unexplained why you're getting that thalamic pain. You really shouldn't feel anything because no sensations are being taken to the cortex, but for some reason, which is not known, you get thalamic pain. Then in the relay nuclei, you have the medial and the lateral geniculate bodies. I already told you about that. The medial is to do with the auditory pathway. So from here, it goes to the temporal lobe, which is part of the auditory pathway. And the lateral geniculate body is to do with vision, and that goes to the occipital lobe. So that's to do with vision. So here itself, try and remember, temporal lobe is to do with audition, occipital lobe is to do with visual pathway. So these were the relay nuclei. So the first group are the relay nuclei where impulses come here, relay, and then they go further. The next are what are known as association nuclei. These are nuclei which are connected to what are known as association areas of the cortex. Association areas are areas where a lot of memory is stored. For example, there'll be a visual association area, there'll be an auditory association area, so then there'll be, an association area for taste. So this stores memory, plus it connects with other areas of the brain. So the dorsal tier of nuclei, these are connected to the association areas, and most of them, as I said, are connected to the cingulate gyrus, which is part of the limbic system, so that deals with memory. And the medial dorsal, which is this one, is connected to the olfactory and limbic system. So you can see in either case it is connected to the limbic system, which deals with memory, emotions. Olfaction also is part of the limbic system, so that's what it's connected to. And then the pulvinar, which is this posterior most area, this pulvinar is connected to, again, visual and the parietal association areas. So these association areas, I don't want you to know exact which part is connected to cingulate, which part is connected to the olfactory and limbic. What I want you to know is that through its association nuclei, and nuclei which are part of that association group, they connect to the olfactory, the limbic system, and this means that it is connected to the cingulate cortex, because that forms part of the limbic system. Then we have the non-specific nuclei, which kind of just, there's nothing specific about them, and that is the reticular nucleus, which is this band outside up here. And this reticular nucleus is important because all projections, when they go out, they have to pass through these reticular nuclei, and as they pass through, they give off little collaterals to it, so keeping the reticular nucleus informed of what is going now. And this in turn is connected to all these thalamic nuclei and exerts an inhibitory control over them. And this reticular nucleus, we'll see later, is part of what is known as the reticular formation. So we'll see that, and the main purpose is that it ensures, this reticular nucleus, it ensures that the thalamocortical system functions in such a way that it is compatible with the conscious experience. That means you are experiencing everything consciously. So, it keeps you aroused or alert. So that is what is the function of this reticular nucleus, and you will see that that is one of the main functions of the reticular system. Now here we are looking at thalamic peduncles. These are thalamic peduncles, and actually before that, because I mentioned it in your notes, I want to go back here to tell you that in this lamina you have what are known as intralaminar nuclei. Here it is, the intralaminar nuclei. They are connected again to the cerebral cortex and basal ganglia, and it is thought that they belong to the reticular formation, and I'll be describing this reticular formation shortly, so then you'll understand the significance. So they are connected to the reticular formation. Now let's look at thalamic peduncles. These are nothing but reciprocal connections between the thalamus and the different areas of the cerebral hemispheres. So if we look up here and I show you, so this is the frontal lobe, this is the parietal lobe, the occipital is here, and this is the temporal lobe. So you can see which areas these peduncles connect. So you have 4 of these. You have one which goes anteriorly, superiorly, posteriorly, and inferiorly. The anterior thalamic peduncle, it connects the thalamus to the frontal lobe, and here in the frontal lobe it connects it to this area which is called the prefrontal cortex, and this has to do with emotions and judgment and so on, and it also connects it with the cingulate cortex, and that again has to do with emotions and the limbic system. The superior thalamic peduncle, as you can see here, it connects it to the frontal and the parietal lobe. And what parts lie here? You have the premotor area, you have the motor area, and you have the sensory area. So this is what it is connecting it to. The posterior thalamic peduncle connects it to the parietal lobe, as you can see, and the occipital lobe. So this connects it to the visual cortex. So this part here is the visual cortex and the occipital lobe, and up here the posterior parietal area, a lot of it has to do with language and other functions, so some of which are related to the limbic system. So again you can see its connection to the limbic system. The inferior thalamic peduncle connects it to the temporal lobe, and in the temporal lobe you have the auditory area. So this area is the auditory area, and on the medial side you have the olfactory area. So here again you can see how it's connecting it to the auditory and the olfactory area. So this is how the thalamic peduncles are connected to the different parts of the cerebral cortex. Let's now do a little bit on reticular formation. And what this reticular formation is a area of gray matter that is spread out through the entire brain stem. So it's through the entire brain stem. So you can see here again through the entire brain stem. And it was a very old neural network which was prominent in the reptilian brain stem. And originally in animals, in lower animals, olfaction was the main thing. So this reticular formation was initially connected to olfaction and limbic system. But when evolution occurred and vision and hearing dominated over olfaction, the reticular formation was then relegated to autonomic functions, and in the humans it is of prime importance in autonomic and reflex activities, and is linked to the limbic system. So you can see that this, how it's passing all the way through. So what it does is it gets, it integrates the activity from different afferent areas. So you can see it is getting input from the eye, from hearing, from the spinal cord. All of this goes to the reticular formation. Now it integrates this information, then it sends this information in an ascending manner, in an ascending tract, and you can see this tract will go up, and actually that tract is called the central tegmental tract, just in case you see this somewhere. It's called the central tegmental tract. And this central tegmental tract, then you can see, goes to the different areas of the cortex. And what it does is it serves as an arousal of the higher central nervous system centers, of the higher centers. So it arouses the higher centers. So that's why this tract, which goes up like this, it ascends, is also known as the ascending reticular activating system. So it's called the ascending reticular activating system. So that is the importance of the reticular formation. So one of its functions is this arousal. So let's, before we go back, let's also see what other things the reticular formation has. This reticular formation has important vital centers in it. If you remember when we did the brain stem, I told you had vital centers within the reticular formation. So you can see you have the respiratory center, you have the cardiovascular centers. This is again part of the respiratory center. So they're present in the pons and the medulla, and they lie within the reticular formation. So that is another important thing to do with the reticular formation. So let's look at some of the functions. It has autonomic functions, and these autonomic functions are like glandular secretion, then vital centers, because these vital centers are connected to, they are under the influence of autonomic centers. It has blood pressure control, and let me see if there's anything else that these are some of the main autonomic functions. Attention and mood, yes, there's another one, attention and mood. So these are the main autonomic functions that it is concerned with. It is also concerned with posture and locomotion, and then of course arousal, as I told you, this ascending reticular activating system. So it maintains the state of consciousness. It maintains the state of consciousness. And in fact, if the reticular system is damaged, it could lead to coma, because the higher centers can no longer be aroused. So that is very, very important. Some of the clinical aspects of it is that general anesthetics, the way they put you, to sleep, is because they suppress this ascending reticular activating system. So they suppress this. And in fact, this reticular formation has been blamed in ADD and ADHD, because what they think is that it's possible that there is over arousal of this ascending reticular activating system, which keeps the higher centers active all the time. So that it has been blamed in that. So this was just a little bit that I wanted to tell you with regard to the reticular system, because we've been talking about it so often, the reticular formation, reticular nucleus, and so on. So I wanted to explain a little bit of some of the functions. So that completes this part of the PowerPoint. So your entire cerebellum and thalamus and reticular system is now over.